Hey everyone, it's Jakov, and I'm here today with a video ranking all the boat infantry units in Total War The Dawnless Days. Before we get started, let's break down what the Dawnless Days is, that being a mod for the game Total War Attila, mod linked in the description of course, completely overhauling the game and basing it off of the world of Lord of the Rings. In previous videos I looked at and compared the pike infantry units in the mod, as well as spear infantry, ranking them in terms of how useful they are, using their statistics, availability, and abilities to determine their rankings. In this video, we'll be doing the same thing, but instead with bow infantry, units that are distinguished by their choice of weapons, bows for shooting enemies at range. At the end of the video, the charts that I use to compare their qualities will be shown. Before I get into the rankings, first, I'd like you to like and subscribe if you like what you're hearing, and after that, I want to make it clear that these rankings are purely my opinion, and as such are subjective, so if my rankings don't match yours, don't feel bad. That said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the units in the comments. All up, the mod, as of version 0.6.0, currently has 38 boat infantry units spread across its various factions, not counting the unique general unit Lurts, who will not be ranked, although the number of boat infantry units may be subject to change in the future, as are these rankings. Several units are also identical in terms of stats and are shared between factions. However, they'll be ranked as separate units due to their role and usefulness changing depending on which faction fields them. With all that said, let's start the rankings. Coming in at last place, we have the Corsair Archers fielded by the Haradrim. A silver tier 2 light bow infantry unit, these guys are in last place for one major reason, their lack of a role. Generally speaking, each faction has an archer unit for each tier, although that's not always the case. When it comes to the Haradrim faction, they do. However, they have two tier 2 units available, this being one of them. This means that there's another unit that fulfills the exact same role, having almost identical stats, without having a limit on recruitment like this unit, which can be filtered to a max strength of 3 per army, meaning that there's no reason at all to choose this unit over the other archer unit at the same tier. Overall, a very mediocre unit that is let down by its inability to be recruited en masse and strong competition from other units in its roster. Just barely avoiding last place, we have the Mirkwood Trackers of the Dol Guldur faction. These bronze tier 1 very light boat infantry rank so low because they're quite literally the only archer unit that their faction can field, meaning that this orc unit, which is rabble of the weakest kind, unable to properly stand up to starting units, will be forced to fight against stronger enemies constantly, including professional tier 3 archers. The reason for this unit being forced into this untenable situation is very simple. The faction of Dol Guldur is quite empty, which means that until more bow units are added, these troops will continue to be at the bottom of the barrel. Just slightly scoring higher than the Mirkwood Trackers are the Mordor Bow Rabble. Contrary to what their name may suggest, these bronze tier 1 very light boat infantry are fielded by Isengard instead of Mordor, being that faction's starting bow unit. Unfortunately for their unit, it has a limit of 3 per army placed on it, meaning that the great strength of orc units, their cheapness and ability to swarm the enemy easily is no longer viable, also meaning that the unit will be forced to fight superior starting archers while at a numerical disadvantage, further adding to their bad status. The only thing which even slightly redeems this unit is that it's not the sole archer unit in its faction, meaning that it won't be required to be used for every army fielded by Isengard the way the previous unit does for Dol Guldur's armies. Next up, we have the Vinland Patrollers, a silver tier 2 light boat infantry unit from the Dale faction. This unit is let down by the fact that it too can only be recruited to a max strength of 3 per army, which is pretty damning given that there's no other tier 2 archers in the faction to pick up the slack, meaning that Dale will have to rely on these troops to provide support for their starting archers in order to contest enemy ranged units. The damning part of it being that Dale is an archer faction first and foremost. Coming in just ahead of the Vinland Yard Patrollers, we have the Blackroot Vale Archers of Gondor. These silver tier 2 medium bow infantry are very similar to the previous unit in terms of role and downsides, being limited to a strength of 3 per army, leaving a gap in their respective factions' archer lineup, and being used to reinforce starting archers to fight off enemy units, although in these guys' case the downsides aren't as glaring, given that Gondor is in an archer faction and instead a melee infantry one, where archers get second billing. Coming in next we have the Forest Rangers of the Woodland Realm. These elven archers make up a silver tier 3 very light boat infantry unit which is restricted to a max strength of 3 per army, which inhibits it from being the ranged core of your army. However, such a role isn't this unit's intent. This unit is meant to be a guerrilla warfare unit, stealthily killing enemies ahead of your main line before your archer corps directly engages their troops. As such, these guys aren't capable of engaging in shootouts with enemy archers, and doing so is a waste, the unit generally fulfilling its role well in its roster, but not as well as the other units coming up. Next up are the Orc Bow Rabble of Mordor, a bronze tier 1 very light bow infantry unit. While this unit is identical to the Mordor Bow Rabble in all stats, this unit is differentiated by the fact that it can be recruited without limit, meaning that amassing a massive amount of them is very easy. The starting archer unit for Mordor, these troops will see sustained service until better forces become available for the faction. Overall, while it is a very poor combat unit all things considered, and will be forced to fight against better foes for a significant amount of time, the unit more easily fulfills its role as a rabble of archers compared to other orcish contemporaries which are forced to fight a professional archers which lack numbers necessary to bring about victory. Just missing out on the top 30 are the Variag Bowmen of the Easterlings. These silver tier 3 heavy bow infantry are the most elite archers the faction can field, but are also fairly unique, being a unit that can match professional archers before converting to melee combat and fighting toe-to-toe with melee infantry, being more of a melee infantry unit with ranged abilities than an archer unit. Due to its unique status, the unit is limited to a max of 3 per army. However, this doesn't hold back the unit, its best use being to add support to your front lines or ranged forces as needed. Although this unit fulfills excellently, although if it was capable of being recruited in large numbers, there'd be no better choice for army composition when playing as the Easterlings. However, the unit truly isn't that necessary to the Easterlings, as they have access to professional archers without recruitment limitations and significant numbers of melee infantry, meaning it's a useful alternative option, but not much more than that. Just barely making it into the top 30 are the Garrison of the Hornburg, a unit fielded by the Rohan faction. As a silver tier 3 heavy bow infantry unit, these troops are not only the peak of Rohan's archers, but are also very similar to the previous unit, being capable of switching between being professional archers and competent melee infantry, added to which is their potential of serving as a general unit, which despite the faction's focus on cavalry, is quite likely to occur. In sieges, when playing as a defender, these troops will make a far more practical and cheaper general than Rohan's cavalry options, the unit capable of boosting your available firepower before transitioning to take up a place in your front lines. Unfortunately for the unit, it's limited in numbers when it comes to recruitment, meaning it can't serve as the core of your army, which would be quite devastating, which means its key use will be to strengthen your archer lines comprised of lesser bowmen, being more of a ranged support unit than the heart of your ranged forces. Coming in at 29th place we have the Clan Huntsmen of the Easterling faction. These bronze tier 1 very light bow infantry are the starting archer unit available to the faction, and as such are a crucial part of any starting army, giving the Easterlings range strength with which to fight. As a starting unit, these guys are immediately better than the previous starting units, not only on the basis of their stats, but also because they can be recruited without restriction, something which would have crippled their usefulness in the early game and cheap armies. Overall, they lack lower than the upcoming starting units only because their stats are somewhat on the lower side, not having the greater range of other units while also lacking armor which makes them more vulnerable to starting skirmishes. Coming in next we have the Desert Bowmen of the Haradrim, another starting archer unit. These bronze tier 1 very light bow infantry will be a major part of securing victory in the early game, as the Haradrim strategy is based on using archers to destroy enemy infantry formations before Haradrim infantry tear them apart. The strategy being all the more focused on this unit due to the Haradrim lacking good infantry in the early game, meaning this unit has to pull through, something which it does, but not as well as some of the other starting bowmen in other factions who have generally better stats. Just beating out the Desert Bowmen we have the Tribal Hunters of the Dunlendings. This unit of bronze tier 1 very light bow infantry is yet another crucial starting bow unit, and does quite well in the role, beating out the competition solely because it's a more rounded unit all things considered, which is an important consideration in a starting unit so as to not fall behind the enemy. Missing out on the top 25, we have the Yeomen of Dale, the starting archer unit for that archer-oriented civilization. These bronze tier 1 very light bow infantry have great range and are generally an excellent beginning archer unit, although due to the faction lacking a stable bow unit directly ahead of these guys, they'll be forced to fight against tougher foes until professional bowmen who can be recruited without restrictions become available. Overall, a highly useful unit. Beating out the yeomen are the mustered archers of Rohan. Another starting archer unit, these bronze tier 1 light boat infantry will be the core of your ranged power in the early game, although given that Rohan is a cavalry faction, these troops aren't quite as crucial as they would be in other factions. However, it's for this reason that I place them ahead of the previous competition, given that despite archers not being the Rohirrim forte, this unit outperforms the other beginning units, having a great combination of stats and price which it really didn't need, but yet still has, making it an overachiever as far as I'm concerned in the Rohan roster, and boosting it that little bit more. Combine this great performance with the fact that the unit doesn't have to fight up-tiered enemies due to Rohan having access to tougher archers, and these guys perform in their role better than ever expected. Up next are the Gondorian Bow Militia, who as the name suggests are a Gondorian unit. The hardiest of the starting bow infantry, these bronze tier 1 medium bow infantry are the linchpin of early Gondorian armies, helping to keep Gondorian rabble units in the game by cutting down vast swaths of enemy units, their stats more than making them up for the job, and capable of outmuscling most equivalent bow units. Being a great early game unit, the Gondorian Bow Militia are forced to be the core of your mid-game ranged power, as Gondor unfortunately lacks a consistent source of mid-tier archers. Many of these troops must work in concert with the Blackroot Vale archers to provide range support for your forces, which means they don't have to face off against tough foes entirely by themselves, but that they will almost always be at a disadvantage where their above average stats do help alleviate the bleeding caused by their use in such situations. Generally a very useful unit, but one which sees its star dim as the game progresses. Coming in ahead of the starting bow units, we have the Haradrim Archers of the Haradrim faction. These silver tier 2 light bow infantry are the reason why the Corsair archers are practically dead in the water upon arrival, actually being capable of being used en masse to replace your desert bowmen, which is a great boon given that a lot of other factions are forced to rely on starting bow units until they gain access to professional bowmen, or forced to field minimal amounts of bowmen against hordes of Haradrim bowmen. That said, they are pretty mediocre all things considered for tier 2 units, having poor range leading them to be outranged by some starting units, although the rest of their stats help keep them above water. Coming in 22nd place, the Runic Archers of the Easterling faction stand tall. While it is true that these silver tier 2 very light bow infantry share the weakness of Evilmen archers, having limited range in comparison to Free People's archers, they do have better range than the previous unit and are hardier, meaning that they can more easily trounce the lesser archers that they'll face, as well as fend off equivalent archers more or less. Overall, a fairly useful unit. Just missing out on the top 20 of the Mountain Pass Scouts, a silver tier 2 light boat infantry unit fielded by the Goblins. As a unit, while these troops are closer to rabble, being the first larger unit available to the faction, they're quite good, capable of easily being amassed at a good price with fairly alright stats, having the strength to defeat a lot of the lesser boat infantry fielded by factions with limited tier 2 options. More so, because the faction has more advanced archers available, these troops have a clearly defined role and don't need to worry about fighting uphill battles against superior foes the way many other archer units do, only needing to fight competition who they can more or less take in a fight. Making it into the top 20, we have the Elder Archers. These silver tier 2 light bow infantry fill a gap in the Dunlending roster, serving as militia tier archers who are honestly on the upper end of quality when it comes to that category, beating out some mid-game archers from more popular factions when it comes to having better stats, showing off that a lot of the Dunlending units slide under the radar despite being quite formidable units all things considered. Next up, the Uruk-hai archers make a stand. Silver tier 2 light bow infantry from the Isengard faction, these troops are desperately needed, given that the only other archer option the faction has available are the terrible Mordor bow rabble which are hamstrung by their limit of 3 per army and terrible battlefield performance. These troops once recruited give Isengard the ability to actually face off against ranged opposition, something that is massively appreciated. True, these are the peak of the faction's bowline, meaning that unless you transition to crossbowmen, you'll be forced to fight uphill battles against tougher opponents, but if you do make that choice, these guys serve perfectly in a mid-game role, shooting with the best of them. Beating out the Uruk-hai archers of their Rohirrim equivalent, the Yeomen of the Mark. Silver tier 2 medium bow infantry. Much like the previous unit, these guys stand ahead of the competition due to not having recruitment restrictions, meaning they can be amassed, although unlike the previous unit, they're not direly required as Rohan has good starting archers. Generally speaking, this unit will be the peak of Rohan's archers as the faction lacks any professional bowmen who can be recruited without restriction, having only the garrison of the Hornburg available. While this would generally mean that the unit will be forced to fight battles not in its favour against tougher foes, because Rohan focuses on horsemen, archers aren't really that much of a concern apart from in sieges, where working alongside the garrison of the Hornburg, they can put down enough fire to send enemy forces running for the hills. A great unit's shortcomings are bypassed by the uniqueness of the faction it finds itself in. Taking 17th place are the Lords of Lasgalen, an elite unit found within the Woodland Realm roster. Gold tier 4 heavy bow infantry, these troops are a potential general for the faction and your quintessential tough elite archer who can also draw swords and engage enemy infantry, being useful in both roles, though not because they're specifically meant to be both archers and swordsmen the way some other units are, but just because they've got such good stats. While their role is to enhance your range power by giving you harder hitting and better enduring bowmen, the unit honestly isn't required. Its 3 unit limit per army not even really affecting it so much as the fact that the Woodland Realm has access to professional bowmen who are practically elite when it comes to their stats and who have no recruitment limits, making this unit more or less superfluous. Overall, I'd say this unit is very much an example of a win more unit rather than one which will change the course of battle. Up next we have the Bardings of Dale, an elite gold tier 4 medium boat infantry unit that can serve as a general for their faction, very similar to the previous unit. As a unit, these troops are limited by their elite status with only 3 being allowed in an army. However, given that they're not meant to be amassed, it doesn't really cripple their usefulness, the Bardings being better at serving as quasi-melee infantry/bowmen, being tough enough to fight evenly with good melee infantry while also providing supporting fire. A pretty useful unit. While it is the peak of Dale's archer line, and as such is arguably the best archer unit that a faction like Dale, which revolves around archers, can field when it comes to stats, it's not as crucial a component of Dalian armies the way that other units are, being a win more unit which helps you when you're already ahead. Coming in 15th, we have the Dwarven Range Travellers who hail from the Erebor faction. As a unit, these Bronze tier 1 very light boat infantry are a crucial component of Dwarven armies, as because Erebor lacks any other archer units until the late game, and specifically lacks any archer units that can be recruited en masse except these guys, the Dwarven Range Travellers will be forced to be the core of your ranged forces until the late game when crossbowmen become available, meaning these troops will be forced to fight an uphill battle against tier 2 enemies. However, because their stats are generally better than most tier 1 units, they can more easily face off against tougher enemies, which is a great boon to this unit's usefulness. Ahead of the Dwarven Range Travellers, we discover the Black Serpent Rangers of the Haradrim faction, a gold tier 4 very light boat infantry unit. These troops are specialists at guerrilla warfare, using their stealth abilities to ambush enemies without being seen and being capable of being deployed ahead of armies. In conjunction with this, the unit is also capable of being a general for the faction, making for an all-around strong unit on the surface, even if it has restrictions of 3 per army. The real weakness of this unit, however, that lets it down is that despite being a gold tier unit, it's easily outmatched when it comes to range combat by a lot of far cheaper and easier to amass units, including some literal starting bowmen. And what this means is that the unit will always be forced to get close to enemy lines to harass them, leaving them highly vulnerable to cavalry, which are already a significant threat for this variety of bowmen. Overall, while they are useful, I consider them a letdown given that they're meant to be the pinnacle of Harad's ranged power, the faction being an archer one, making it all the more disappointing, although to their credit they give the faction flexibility that otherwise be missing and a boost in hitting power. Beating out the Black Serpent Rangers, we have their northern variant, Rangers of Rovanian, fielded by the Dale faction. As a unit, these gold tier 4 very light boat infantry are just generally better than the previous unit for a couple of reasons. First, they combine the stealth capabilities of the ranger units with the enhanced range of Dale units and other Free People's archers, meaning they're not as likely to be caught out of place by enemy horsemen and slaughtered. Second, because this unit doesn't have the capacity to be a general, it means it can be used at its max strength of 3 per army offensively to harass enemy forces, something that the previous unit can't do due to the immense danger of deploying a general ahead of your lines. Overall, this unit is just an enhanced version of the Black Serpent Rangers that can bring more firepower to bear and as such is that much more useful when playing as Dale. Finishing off the trio of ranger units, we have the Athelian Rangers of Gondor, another gold tier 4 very light bow infantry unit. These troops are very much neck and neck with the previous unit, however I feel that these troops as a result of being a devastating stealth archer unit in a primarily infantry oriented faction get quite a bit more mileage, whereas the Rangers of Ovanian are more to be expected given their position within the Dale roster, so these guys are far more of a nice surprise that makes Gondor that much tougher to beat and more lethal when it comes to ranged combat. Barely missing out on the top 10, the Archers of the Red Mountains stand despondent. These silver tier 3 medium bow infantry are in a bit of a weird spot as they are professional infantry that are let down by a limit of 3 per army. This restriction doesn't really affect them. The reason for this is because Everball transitioned to crossbowmen in elite armies, meaning that archers aren't as imperative as they are in other factions, with them being more of a support unit that gives you tactical flexibility as well as enhanced firepower, this unit doing excellently in such a role. Overall, a good unit, but one that's not that critical to success or even survival the way that the upcoming units are. Just sliding into the top 10, we have the Goblin Heavy Archers. As the name suggests, these silver tier 3 medium bow infantry are fielded by the Goblin faction, where they fulfill the role of professional late game archers. While the unit is somewhat lacking when it comes to stats compared to other equivalent units, it's still very useful in elite Goblin armies where it gives the faction the firepower to stand up to elite foes, even if at a somewhat diminished level. Its lack of recruitment restrictions also helping it to stand out in a positive light. Beating out the Goblin Archers, we find ourselves facing the Serpent Archers of Harad. Silver tier 3 medium bow infantry, these troops are the Haradrim equivalent of professional bowmen and are quite useful in that role, having better stats and more usefulness than the previous unit, even if it must be said that the unit lacks range compared to some of the other equivalent units it's expected to face, meaning that in battle it is slightly more vulnerable when it comes to arrow exchanges. However, compared to other archer units in its roster, its amassability at a professional level leaves it standing above the competition. Making it to 8th place are the Lokai Rim Archers of the Eastling faction, yet another example of a professional archer unit, being Silver tier 3 medium bow infantry. These troops will make up the core of the faction's ranged forces in elite armies, occasionally being supported by the Variag archers, although these troops are far more critical to success than that unit given that these guys can be amassed without restrictions. Overall, these troops give you the ability to fight toe-to-toe with archer civilizations, which is very much appreciated, and while stats-wise they're not quite as competent as the upcoming units, they're still better than the previous units in my opinion. Coming in at 7th place are the professional archers of the Dunlending faction, the Dunherd Archers. These silver tier 3 medium bow infantry are very much an overlooked unit, their stats and combat abilities all around being damn great for an evilman faction, even more so when you consider that the Dunlendings aren't an archer civilization the way the Haradrim are, yet their bowmen slightly outperform them. Overall, a very useful unit and one which I endeavour more people to use, as it really does give the Dunlendings additional firepower that help round out their operational strength. Missing out on the top 5 by a hair are the Marksmen of Dale, who hail from Dale. Silver tier 3 heavy bow infantry. These are the professional archers who will make up the core of your ranged forces in late game armies. Being all around great units which don't let down the reputation of Dale as an archer civilization, working well in concert with the faction's other elite archer units to annihilate enemies at range. The reason these guys miss out on the top 5 is that while they're a damn good unit, that's to be expected of the professional peak of an archer civilization, unlike the upcoming units which despite not being part of archer civilizations, smash it out of the park when it comes to performance and usefulness. Just getting their toe into the door to get top 5 are the Gondor Archers of Gondor. These silver tier 3 heavy bow infantry are the epitome of professional archers, having great all-around stats while not being burdened by a recruitment limit, meaning that in elite armies or in armies where they can be afforded, these troops should be the core of your archer force, working in combination with the Ithilien Rangers to thin out your enemy's ranks. Overall, these units fulfill their role well and are a clear shoo-in for any Gondorian army. However, compared to the upcoming units, they're not as crucial or as great a combination of stats and prices. Still a great unit though. Making it into the top 5 but just missing out on the top 3 are the Uruk Archers of Mordor. These silver tier 3 medium bow infantry are the professional archers of a faction which relies on quantity rather than quality to bring about victory, although in these guys' case they balance the inherent downsides of orcs, such as their lack of range, by generally being hardy units all around, these troops being the perfect unit to replace the terrible orc bow rabble, giving Mordor firepower enough to contest even the most professional and elite of foes, these troops being a massive part of Mordor's armies that make success viable. Overall, a highly useful unit which if missing would make Mordor almost impotent when it comes to ranged combat. Claiming bronze today and making it into the coveted top 3 stand the Lasguln Archers of the Woodland Realm. These silver tier 3 medium bow infantry are the archers whom the forest rangers are meant to work together with. These troops capable of being recruited in bulk as the core of your ranged forces who can directly engage with enemy archers in shootouts. In reality, however, the forest rangers aren't really needed and these guys put in more than enough effort in battle that extra support tends to be superfluous. While they aren't the sole archer unit available to the faction and as such aren't as critically important as other archer units which are the only archers in their respective factions, in my honest opinion they're the only one the Woodland Realm needs, unlike others in the faction being capable of being recruited without limit or possessing a great combination of price and stats, easily being in the core of the faction's ranged forces and more than overshadowing the competition from within their own roster. Coming in to snatch the silver, we have the Noldorin Archers of Linden, a unit of silver tier 3 medium bow infantry who have stats comparable with those of elite gold tier bowmen while also being capable of being amassed in large numbers. True, this unit is somewhat expensive, however it makes up for it in quality, being capable of flogging just about any enemies it faces. The unit's usefulness being boosted by the fact that Linden is a faction with limited units available, meaning this unit proportionally is far more important and crucial than many other units. Its existence giving the faction the strength to hold off just about any foe. Taking the gold medal in today's video, we have the Noldorin Archers of Imladris, whose stats-wise are identical to the previous unit. While you may wonder why I chose to distinguish them, it's because while these silver tier 3 medium bow infantry are an incredibly crucial part of their faction strategies, similar to their Linden counterparts, they're even more critical, given that in the current state of the mod, their faction is almost completely bereft of units, even more so than the Linden faction to which the previous unit belonged. Because of this, the unit will always see sustained combat in both a ranged role and in melee, as once these troops expend their arrows, they're quite useful in melee in a support role, helping to bolster the active number of troops that Imladris can field and giving the faction a fighting chance against foes, given this is the only archer unit they have available, yet it is the only one that they need given it perfectly suits their purposes. So there we have it, all the boat infantry in the current version of the mod ranked. Remember, these rankings are purely subjective, so if you disagree, please let me know in the comments. I'd absolutely love to know what you think, as it will give me insight that I'd otherwise be lacking. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's massively appreciated. More ranking videos will be coming up, as well as army build videos, as well as battle scenarios too, so if you like the sounds of that, stick around the channel. Before I head out, I'll give a reminder that the tables that I use to compare the units are just coming up, but with all that said, this is your host Jakov, signing out.